I'm the Executive Director of VNext Orange County, which is a subchapter of vnext.org up in Seattle. If you want to start your own user group under vnext.org, you just have to visit the site and download the user group kit, and then you're off. If you have any questions, you can give me a call. My email is probably the best email, would be tenacity@outlook.com if you have any questions. So we're here today for a very special event. We have here Mr. Charles Petzold, and he is a world-renowned author and developer. We also have interviewing here Karen Graham. Would you like to say what you do?
Hi, Karen Graham. I'm user interface designer and a Windows enthusiast.
Yes, and she helped us with the LA Silverlight user group as well. So, thank you, Mr. Petzold, very much.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, great. We're really excited. He has a very interesting presentation coming. We're the first to see it, so we can't talk about it. But what I wanted to ask you is, you have a new book out, right?
Yes.
And it is the 6th edition
of Programming Windows.
Okay. Can you give me a history of that Programming Windows series?
Okay. I started writing articles about Windows programming for Microsoft Systems Journal in 1986. Primarily because I knew the editor. He had worked at Ziff Davis, which published PC Magazine, which I had been writing for. And I wrote for MSJ the first article about Windows programming to appear in a magazine.
Awesome.
And that attracted the attention of people at Microsoft. So when Microsoft Press decided they wanted to have a book about Windows programming, and this was in the Windows 1 days, and this was in 1986, I believe, they asked me. And I had never written a book before, but I jumped at the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
I very much wanted to write a book. And so I started writing Programming Windows using Windows 1.0 or Windows 1.01.
Wow.
And about halfway through the book, Windows 2 betas started being available, so I had to shift the focus of the book to Windows 2. That first edition didn't sell very much because there were not a lot of developers were working in Windows yet. Mm-hmm. But in the early 90s, I revised the book for Windows 3 and then Windows 3.1. And at that time, a lot of DOS developers were realizing that they would need to start coding for Windows. Mm-hmm. So they bought my book, a lot of them. And that's primarily the origin of my fame 20 years ago. People bought Programming Windows, 2nd and 3rd editions. And the 4th edition was for Windows, was revised for Windows 95.
Okay.
And I believe that was the 32-bit revision. Or was it Windows 98? I don't know. Windows 98 was the 5th edition. And that was a long time ago. That was about 15 years ago. Mm-hmm.
Come a long way too.
So all through that time, people were asking, will there be a 6th edition of Programming Windows? And I said, no. You know, it's Win32. It's come to an end.
Yes.
And then they announced Microsoft announced what Windows 8 was going to be all about. And of course, the API is totally different. Right. So we decided, yes, that it was time for a 6th edition of Programming Windows.
Absolutely. Whole new paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
So that's what I spent most of last year doing, yes.
Okay. Yeah, well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, really excited when it came out, to the public. I had the beta versions I was looking at, so that's very exciting. Now, what 2 books are your favorites? And I know I said mention 2 because I think I know the answer, but I might not.
2 books that come to mind are both novels that convinced me why I could not be a novelist.
And why is that?
Because I was not brave enough to write these books. These two books I read both when I was a teenager, I guess, because I had wanted to be a writer since I was like 10 years old, and I always thought I'd be writing novels and screenplays. And I encountered two novels that were so daring and so honest in certain ways that I realized I could not do it. There was no way I could have written these two novels. These two novels both have a rather scandalous reputation. One of them is Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, and the other is Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth.
Very interesting.
Portnoy's Complaint, my mother read it first, and she tossed the book in the garbage after about 15 pages. I read it a little later and just thought it was so funny, and so honest about being an adolescent male. And I realized I could never be that honest in writing.
Yeah.
And so later on, writing nonfiction, programmer tutorial is a little different.
Yeah, it is. It is, absolutely. Especially coming from an adolescent male's perspective, I've got to check out these books. So you've also written two other books that aren't really a developer's book. They give more of a history.
If somebody were to ask me what my major accomplishment in life was, it would be the two books, Code, The Hidden Language of Computer Hardware and Software, which was published around 1999, I guess, and The Annotated Turing, a guided tour through Alan Turing's historic paper on computability and the Turing machine, which was just published by Wiley a couple of years ago. And both these books, I had spent a lot of time with them before anybody else really saw anything about them. I had this idea for years that I would try to write a book about how computers work that would be different from anybody else's book about how computers work. And I couldn't describe this book to people adequately, and I had to write 100 pages of it first, and then I gave it to my agent who sent it to Microsoft Press, and they were all enthusiastic about it. But it really traces through digital technology, starting with switches and builds up to logic gates and how they are put together to make simple adders and things like that. The Annotated Turing was another book that I originally encountered Alan Turing's 1936 paper on computability when I was researching Code, and I tried to read it and found it impossible. It's an extraordinarily difficult paper. It uses a strange German font, and he really assumes that you have a certain background in certain areas of mathematics, and when I read this paper for the first time, or tried to read it and tried to understand it, I thought, somebody should write a book about this paper. This paper is so important to the history of computing and so difficult to read. Somebody should write a book about it. And once I get once that idea is implanted in my head, somebody should write a book about it.
Then you sit down and go,
And that was another book I couldn't publicly say I'm trying to write this book because I had to prove to myself that I was able to do it.
Yeah, right.
And because I realized, and the book it takes Alan Turing's 1936 paper, which is about 38 pages long, and cuts it up into pieces and presents it in its entirety, but with a lot of commentary along the way, so that people can at least make a little headway in understanding it. But I realized that if I was going to write this book, I would need to understand every word in that paper. Right. Every single word,
forward,
symbol,
backwards.
And it was a very difficult thing to do. And I can remember struggling over individual sentences in that paper. There was one sentence that took me about a week.
Oh, I can believe it. I mean, I've begun to read it. I haven't finished it. It's not easy to read, and if he's taking something that he understood and made it easy to read, it's fascinating, but it's not an easy read. There's a lot of math in there, and
So later on, in about an hour or so, you will see some indications of another kind of book along these lines that I would like to write.
great.
I am, when researching code, code has a bit about the history of computing and all, and a lot of the history of computing, it starts about 1936 and goes to the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and of course. But I got interested more in what's called the prehistory of computing. What happened prior to the 1930s? And part of what happened prior to the 1930s was analog computing. And there was a very interesting machine made by the Scottish scientist William Thomson, otherwise known as Lord Kelvin, in the 1870s, a machine to predict the tides based on Fourier analysis of tides, and you'll see a little glimpse of this in the talk I'm giving. And that machine turned out to be interesting, not just from a technological perspective, but how it fits into the history of science in the 19th century. Because one of the reasons that Lord Kelvin got interested in the tides, and he designed and built this tide machine, was that he wanted to disprove evolution.
Okay.
So that makes it, of course, very interesting.
Oh yeah, right.
And this chapter in the history of the conflicts in the history of science has not been told, really. There's been a lot of books about the controversy of Darwin and the theory of evolution, and books about the development of thermodynamics, but no book that really focuses on this machine as something that plays a very interesting role. It's interesting that one of the first things that we can identify as an analog computer had a non-purely scientific reason for its existence.
Isn't that how it goes? Many times.
Yeah. But there's other aspects of computing, if you use the word computing very loosely, to mean anything that assists you in your mathematics. One of the most important developments was the invention of logarithms, which took place during Queen Elizabeth's reign. This was enormously helpful to people who had to do a lot of multiplications and divisions. Like Johannes Kepler thought that logarithms was like a gift that would allow him to do calculations with much more speed than he ever imagined.
Well, I'll tell you, the Microsoft Press was kind enough to give all of our attendees the front cover facsimile of the book code.
Okay.
Because I love the cover of the book code. Everybody loves the cover of the book code. For those of you who have never seen it, it's a plain white cover with the word code, and then it has Braille and Morse code and binary.
ASCII, yes.
Yeah. So, and you discuss how Braille and Morse code preceded binary.
Right.
So
As
that
early
itself,
forms of digital code.
Exactly. So fascinating. So Charles will be autographing that for everybody tonight. So we're very lucky with that too. So thank you, Microsoft Press. So you prefer how-to books over history kind of books, or?
The programming tutorials, in a certain sense, are much easier to write.
Oh, sure.
They have, to me, writing about code that one has written is very easy. There are certain challenges in writing a programming tutorial, such as figuring out the order that the material is presented and the pacing through it, and to come up with little programming examples for each little thing, because you don't want to the bigger the programming example, the more difficult people are going to have in understanding it. If you can show us one API with just a few lines of code, that's ideal. But it's nice to have the program actually do something interesting. And so when I'm writing a programming tutorial, a lot of the code comes first, and then I can discuss the code, which I find fairly easy. But there are challenges, but the challenges are nothing compared to a book like Code or the Annotated Turing or these future hypothetical books on that concern various chapters in the prehistory of computing.
Okay, great. That's something for us to look forward to, I think. Now, before I ask the last question, Karen, do you have questions?
Sure. You know, as I said earlier, one of my favorite things was using your books to help me achieve things in the UI that we programmers just didn't see. What do you think are going to be the biggest challenges for user interface designers as we start working with Windows 8?
Touch. It's
the whole gesturing and interactiveness.
Yeah, it's yes.
Is it just that people expect it and we haven't worked with it, or that?
I think there's a challenge in getting a screen that's very responsive to touch and that moves in a natural way. I mean, prior to touch, we had a bit of pen computing. I did some work with that, and there was this whole set of gestures where you would do the pen in like a delete symbol, and meant something should be deleted. And with touch gestures, we don't have that anymore. It's a different type of gesture, but we are accustomed to pinch and expand and rotate and all, and sweeping. But to combine some of these is very challenging. I have a couple 3D scenes in the presentation I'm giving tonight, and I wanted to move the camera with touch. So I implemented this interface to move the camera up and down and left and right. But then I wanted to add panning as well. And so if you're using one finger to move the camera around in a circle, what do you do to move the camera just in a plane? And I decided I would have fingers on the top and bottom. And then I was using taps to change scenes, to add things to the 3D scene. And then when I got to the point, how do I get that scene off and onto my next slide? And so I have this double tap, which puts it in a different mode, and then I could sweep it off. And it was just, but I was trying to do the whole presentation that I'm doing in about 10 minutes or so with touch. I had originally thought I would be cradling the tablet in my hand and just walking around and doing the whole presentation like that. I later decided that's a little tricky because of the video cable coming out. You don't want that to fall out, and it's a different type of adapter than the adapter in the docking unit that I put the tablet in. So I had the tablet on the desk, and it could as well be a laptop, with a keyboard. But I did the whole presentation so I would have a touch-only interface.
Well, we'll watch for that for sure.
And and it's all written in Windows 8. And it uses a flip view control, which was one of my favorite things in Windows 8. And this flip view it's a selection control, like a list view, except that you only see one item at a time, and you just sweep through it, either up or down, and to the next item. And it turned out to be great for certain types of controls, like a date or time selection was ideal for that. Or I even used it like for an e-reader app where you're flipping the pages side to side. And so it was a natural for this particular presentation to have a series of slides in the flip view and sweep them to side by side.
Well, great. Looking forward to it.
So one last question, and then this is kind of open-ended. So what do you like and what don't you like, or what would you improve on Windows 8?
Well, I was first introduced to XAML and not C# program, but XAML through the Windows Presentation Foundation, WPF. And there's a lot of stuff in WPF that just didn't make it into the XAML environments after that, which have been Silverlight, and then Windows Phone, and now Windows 8. And there are certain things I miss a lot in WPF. And I'm not sure they would be meaningful to a non-WPF programmer. But there's, for example, in WPF, elements have two properties named render transform and layout transform. And these transforms allow you to apply scaling factors or rotation factors to elements. And the render transform just affects the element and not the element as it exists in layout with other elements. And the layout transform then, but does affect other elements. So if you rotate a text block, that text block becomes taller in layout, and then it becomes shorter. And that layout transform it didn't make it into Silverlight. It's not in Windows Phone. It's not in Windows 8. And when you need something like that, it's really handy. And I miss it a lot. There's also a lot of customization stuff you can do in WPF. I did an article for MSDN Magazine on customizing, doing your own animation classes. You can't do that in any of the other. There's numerous things that missed the cut in Silverlight, and because Windows Phone was based on Silverlight and Windows 8 to a large extent was based on Silverlight, they're gone now.
Yes. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, Mr. Petzold. And thank you, Karen, too. And thank you, everybody, for watching.